Welcome everybody to episode 27, Meet with Cheese Metaverse Interviews. I'm your host, LeDrop WithCheese, coming to you from the Metaverse as usual. Today, I have a visionary, legendary guest on my show. He is the professor and chair of computer science at Concordia University. He's a former competitive eater. He's a Bitcoin OG. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Dr. Michael Litman. Thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show today, Michael.
Yep, you got it.
So we got to meet last week at MKE Tech Week at one of the evening events. It was like meeting all these startup companies, and it was a really cool setting. A lot of energy, positive energy. But after our conversation was like, you're going to want to interview me, Joey. And I was like, who is this guy? And then by the end, I'm like, this is one of the most interesting people I've ever met. So I'm really glad that you're on my show and we get to talk and people get to hear about what you're doing. So just tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are now.
Oh, okay. Well, so I guess that's somewhat of an interesting story. I'll try to make it fairly concise, take us down a direct path. So, well, I mean, I guess ever since I was, I'm in my, let's see, I'm born 1978, so I'm 44 now. So I'm younger than maybe most people who've been teaching in higher ed for 24 years and stuff like that. But I've been entrepreneurial since I was a kid. My dad was a dentist. And when he started looking at retiring, fairly rich people go to these conferences. We're like, hey, how are you going to make your, what are you going to do with your spare time once you retire? Well, my dad came home with a bunch of boxes for like real estate crap. So my brother and I, tore apart the boxes, and, we have very complementary skill sets. So my brother's like a workhorse. He is the guy, he'll put the rubber to the road. He was riding his bike to go, we were doing short sales in real estate, and he was riding his bicycle over these people's houses, negotiating with them, with the bank, all sorts of stuff like that. So he kind of embraced that side of it, where I was always focused on how do we automate this and scale this. So my first couple of companies were family businesses dealing with real estate, where I created automation software and that we then went around to various conferences, selling it and partnering with them on their first deal and all sorts of crap like that. So even from a pretty young age, in my early teens, I was already looking at, how can I take computer programming as a kind of as a superpower and apply it to problems that other people aren't applying it to now, kind of with a focus on automation. And then I just kept running with that. I, went and got a bachelor's, a master's, a PhD in computer science. Somewhere along the road there, I was always the big eater in my group. So my buddies entered me in a eating contest, and I kept winning them, and one thing led to another, and all of a sudden I'm a member of the International Federation of Competitive Eating, distance eating side. You probably have seen the Nathan's hot dog stuff on July 4th. Those are the speed eaters, how much you can consume in 8, 10, or 12 minutes. Distance eaters eat for an hour. So I've been on several different travel channel shows. Big Beef Paradise is one of them, things like that, where that was after I retired from the competitions, but I was still doing like cameo things on episodes of shows, things like that. Man versus Food. When he came up to Milwaukee, I met with him up here. So that was kind of a little segue in my the computer science tech industry type stuff. But I started my let's call it my most computer sciencey business, which was attached to my stage name for competitive eating, which is Awesome Fat. So my stage name for my TV name, I tell people my TV name was Awesome Fat. And so then I named a mobile application software development company that. Ended up doing a lot of iPhone, Android, iPad applications. And this started in the very, very early days of iOS. I had 4 apps on the iOS App Store the day it went live. This is about a year and a half before Google even had a Play Store. So I was already kind of tinkering with it, messing with it, then saying, hey, maybe this is the next thing, like a website, where every company is going to want to have a mobile app. You know, we assume every company has a website. Now we're starting to get to the point where we can assume they have a mobile app too, or we at least ask, do they have an app? So I kind of got into that. And that's where I kind of merged my business side to my higher education side, where I started hiring. My background is language theory, so I like write programming languages. So I've been programming since I was 9, and that's kind of, I would say, my superpower. I'm just very good at that particular skill, even within the larger skill set in computer science. So I started recruiting my computer programming students as interns, having them work for my company, cherry picking the good ones to work full-time afterwards, and then write letters of recommendation for the other ones. So I kind of had a little system going for keeping the company going with fresh students who were always up to date on the latest stuff, and I was training these students as part of their college education. Sold my client base in December 2014, I guess was probably the last sale. So then since then, I've just been a lowly professor, but still doing quite a bit of consulting and stuff on the side. Mostly in the, I like to call it blockchain space, but really it's what most people call the cryptocurrency space today. I'm not a fan of attaching it to the word currency. But I'm very big into virtual reality and augmented reality with the hardware. And more recently, and probably my biggest effort right now, is towards quantum computing stuff. I think we're going to see a pretty big move in quantum computing over the next 6 months or so.
Wow. Yeah, that's an impressive background. And that's why I'm glad you're on here, because you're part of our motto is people and projects you need to know about. So thanks again for coming on. But for the people out there who don't know what quantum computing is, how would you define that?
Well, if you go and watch some videos on it, you'll be freaked out for the rest of the day. Well, it really is that. So, if what quantum really talks about is how do particles behave at the smallest little thing. As human beings, we approach life logically. As computer scientists, we approach life ridiculously logically. Our whole life is around, creating logic puzzles around things. And we think as human beings that we know how the world works around us. Until we start investigating things at the very, very, very tiny level. That's kind of what quantum's about, the unimaginably small particles and things like that, and how they behave. And the punchline with quantum is they behave in a consistent way, but they don't behave in the way you would expect them to behave. And so quantum computers are effectively probabilistic engines. They're based on whether or not something is probably going to be the answer or probably not going to be the answer. Kind of a famous experiment that quantum is based on is this experiment called the double slit experiment. I don't know if you've ever heard of this before, but you could find cartoon representations of it on YouTube if you just do a search for double slit experiment. And the premise of it is if you take a flashlight, you have a piece of cardboard up, let's say it has 2 little slits in it. You take a flashlight and you shine it through the slits, you'd expect to see like a spotlight on the wall behind the cardboard. It ends up not being that, though. It ends up being this big pattern across the screen, which is called an interference pattern. Well, so then the scientists say, well, why is that? So they're thinking, oh, well, maybe because we have, with a flashlight, light is made up of a whole bunch of photons. So maybe it's because we're throwing 4 zillion photons through there at once. So they created a machine that only fired 1 photon at a time. All right. So that way they don't have to worry about collisions or anything. And it had the same result. Same result. You still had this interference pattern on the back wall instead of a single dot coming through with each of the individual photons. So like, okay, well, that's weird. So then they decided to set up an experiment to look at those photons as they're passing through the slits and see what's happening. And as soon as they look at it, the result of the wall changes. As soon as they observe, try to look at what's happening with the photons, they no longer create the interference pattern. Now they create single dots. So it's almost like it's like freaky deaky stuff where you haven't changed anything with the experiment other than you've observed something that was going on. You didn't touch anything, you just looked at it and the result changed based on you looking at it. Einstein called this was a spooky behavior at a distance or something like that. Like something at that subatomic level behaves differently when we measure it versus not measuring it. And it's kind of blows your mind, and we don't really understand why it works that way, but it does work that way, and it consistently works that way. And quantum computers are built around the idea that we can always rely on them behaving in this freaky deaky way.
Yeah.
And then how do you solve problems with that concept in mind that doesn't make logical sense when as human beings we are logical problem solvers? But quantum allows us to solve problems that classical normal computers can't solve. And the biggest thing we're going to see moving forward is, I think I mentioned earlier, in like the next 6 months. And I think it legitimately can be in that time period. We're not talking about the next 10 years. Where now there are physical quantum computers that are being built by places like IBM and Google, now that those guys are getting complex enough to be able to be capable of solving these real problems, we're all of a sudden going to be able to take the theoretical benefits of quantum. Because right now there's a whole bunch of problems that people have figured out how to solve in quantum, and one of them revolves around the you've probably seen on your phone at some point booting up or whatever, that most of our modern day encryption uses something called RSA, or it's built on top of RSA, and that's the initials of the scientists that founded this thing. But at the end of the day, what is RSA? The idea with most of our modern day encryption is we have some gigantic number that is the product of two large prime numbers. Fine, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But if you have this giant number and I asked you, tell me what two primes were multiplied together to give you that number, that's computationally very, 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 very difficult to do. Takes trillions of years on a classical computer as we make that number bigger and bigger and bigger. A quantum computer can figure that out in like a few minutes. So all of a sudden, all this stuff that we think our credit card transactions are all protected and things like that, whenever you see the little padlock in your web browser, behind the scenes, that's being encrypted with something involving prime numbers like I just described. And now all of a sudden, overnight, we could have a physical computer that can, instead of taking 3 trillion years, it could take 3 minutes to get those two numbers, which then allows all sorts of decryption of private information, things like that. And the reason why we're at the cusp of this becoming a problem is we've already solved the problem of factoring those two prime numbers out of the large number using quantum logic. The problem is most of our quantum computers right now are classical computers mimicking quantum. So under the hood, it's still a classical computer and limited, bound by the speed of a classical computer. While as the computers that IBM and Google are building, as these quantum computers, the physical quantum computers are becoming more and more complex with a larger number of these things called qubits on them, all of a sudden we won't have to run that software on a let's fake it until we make it thing running on a classical computer. Now we can run our quantum solution on a real quantum computer. And now you're actually benefiting from for lack of a better phrase, the probabilistic speed of quantum computing, where it can hold every single state at the same time. And then as soon as you measure it, you get your answer, and it's just fascinating. But it's going to become a problem for the security industry as soon as those physical computers exist. Then there's all sorts of other interesting problems you can solve with quantum. And quantum doesn't replace classical computers. Some problems are solvable in classical computers just fine. Other ones are just they're order NP problems. They're very called time complexity type problems, and quantum tends to be very good at solving those. So it's just this whole new field where we already have the knowledge base of quantum. We don't have the hardware to run it quite yet at any sort of scale, but with big players like Google, IBM, Microsoft has a programming language around quantum called Q#. And so we're at the cusp of, as soon as the actual hardware is real, you're going to see this giant move in the quantum space. And I think there's opportunities right now to get involved there.
All right. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is quantum computing. Yes, thank you for that. I did follow what you were saying, and the way you explained it, I feel like a lot of people will have at least a conceptual idea of what quantum computing is now. So thank you for that. But you've always had this great ability to identify like the next big thing, and something that you're geeking out about right now, like me too. I have an Oculus headset, but you're very much into the VR, AR, especially headsets. There's a big announcement this week from Meta. So tell us a little bit about what's going on with you in VR and AR.
Okay, well, a bunch of stuff there. So I've been involved in VR programming for a long time, since like the HTC Vive first came out. So you kind of look at the history of our modern day VR. You're probably talking about I don't know, let's call it a 10-year period or so that we can roll back until we start seeing the first headsets. But early on, they didn't even have hand controls and things like that. Then they came out with some cool hand controls. You had Oculus, you had HTC, you had a couple other companies that tried to compete there. Now we have several different companies that have headsets that are tethered to a computer, a PC. And that's probably where your best looking virtual reality is going to come from. But about 3 years ago, it was probably about 4 years ago that we had the first move towards mobile VR. And even before that, I guess you had Google Cardboard. For those of you who messed around with like your smartphones and decided, oh, I want to see VR stuff, you could buy, it was called Google Cardboard. It was a little cardboard kit. You folded it and you put your phone into it. You just held it up to your face. And that allowed you to experience VR looking all around and that kind of stuff. Well, as those products kind of got better and better and better, we started having we fast forward to today, the widest used headset today is what's called the Oculus. Well, now it's called the Meta Quest 2. It was called the Oculus Quest 2. Facebook had purchased the company Oculus some years back. And then many of you maybe know the story about a year and a half ago-ish or so is when, actually, it was a year ago. Probably a year ago tomorrow, I bet pretty close, is when Facebook changed their company name to Meta. And that happened at their Facebook Connect event, which is this year's event is tomorrow morning. I want to say it's like at 6 a.m., but I'm not at 6 a.m. Central Time. I think it might be 8 a.m. West Coast time, but I'll have to confirm that. But it is tomorrow is their event. And they're expected to release a new headset, possibly 2 headsets. And so I have some speculation on that. But the big movement right now has been towards fully mobile, untethered headsets. And really, this is where it kind of gets into what's the appropriate use for VR. And it actually goes pretty hand in hand with the discussion we had the other night about the appropriate use of blockchain. A lot of times, the things that we use new technology for initially isn't really the killer application for it. VR is a good example of that. Is when people think of VR, they pretty much now think about video games. And why is that? Well, in the early VR headsets, the only computers that could drive those VR headsets were the people who had PC video game rigs with really expensive graphics cards in them. And so that's their target audience was gamers. So the experiences they had to create were video games. Well, now we're moving away from that. Not that we're getting rid of the games, but we have this new kind of how do we apply virtual reality to business problems, serious problems, home entertainment problems. I mean, I would argue you haven't lived until you've watched some sports inside of VR. basketball, like NBA is highly represented, where you can, you basically can sit either on the backboard or on the side court at floor level, as if you're at the basketball game, and watch these players come by, and it's free. Eventually they're teeing it up where they're going to charge for, a season pass or something like that. But, if you think a floor seat at an NBA game is, $600 up to $3,000, depending on the importance of the game. And all of a sudden you can get on for $30 and have a view from the floor. That's pretty cool. But, kind of the selling point for that is I've found myself watching sports that I would never watch in real life, but because it's in VR, it's intriguing. For instance, I was never into like MMA fighting and things like that, but VR has made big strides into MMA fights, where they have these 4 and 8K cameras all around the ring. So you're basically watching a fight from like the referee's perspective. And it's ridiculous. I'll sit there and just watch these fights for hours on end with no interest in the fighting. It's just fascinating. And so now you're starting to see how something like virtual reality can really, in many ways, replace going to the ballpark, going to the stadium, going to the arena, whatever it is. Now, humanists might sit there and have the argument like, okay, well, is that good? Do we need to take people further and further and further out of society? Well, probably not, but it's going to happen regardless. We might as well have fun while we're doing it, is kind of the deal. And so my consulting business now, which also works heavily in the VR and AR space, we're working with some companies trying to create their internal special sauce, whatever their business does. So we have one business we work with in Madison that has a very specific way that they do business that is kind of their secret sauce, and we're building a mimic of that in virtual reality that they would then own. And now they have a new way of offering their services, probably at a lower cost because their overhead is less. And it's got kind of a lower hanging fruit for people to get involved. So my vision for VR is in 3 to 5 years, probably, in fact, I believe less than that, but let's just say 3 to 5 years. I think that's conservative. Many people will have a VR headset, just like people have a smartphone today. If you roll back to the early days of iPhone, not everybody had a smartphone. Well, now we just assume that somebody's carrying around a smartphone of some vintage. They just might have one of the cheap Android phones, right? They might not have one of the flagship things. I think the same thing will be true in the virtual and augmented reality space. And what we saw over the last 2 years with, 2 years with Facebook, now Meta, they've been subsidizing the price of their device. They recently just raised the price of the Quest 2 by $100. So they've been losing money on that device, trying to get it into as many people's hands as possible, where they've been trying to create this thing called the Metaverse, which is a singular place for everybody to meet in virtual space. If your viewers haven't read the book, Ready Player One and Ready Player Two are really, really great reads. There's a movie based on Ready Player One that's pretty good, but the book's much better. But the movie's fine. But it's that kind of thing where we have this virtual space that society basically lives in. And they digest that space through a VR headset. The danger we're in right this second is that right now, Facebook owns, let's call it the metaverse done right. It's a software-driven world right now, and that's really what's going to be interesting about the rest of this year, even the announcement this week. I don't know how much you want me to get into some of the hardware things that have announced recently, but I think that gives us a very good idea of better hardware doesn't necessarily mean a better experience. You'd like to have the best hardware with the best experience, and then you get the ultra best experience. But right now, I think the people who have the best hardware have among the worst software, where Meta 100% controls the software ecosystem of the metaverse. Well, 100% is probably not fair. We'll call it 99.2%. There's a couple of things maybe floating around in there. And their hardware is pretty good. So I would still say if I was telling somebody to get a VR headset right this second, I'd tell them to buy a Quest 2. Even at the $400 for the smaller capacity, the 128 gigabyte, I still think it's your best way to get into virtual reality. Even though we have a new headset that just came out 3 weeks ago over in Asia, the company who's the parent company of TikTok has set themselves up to be a direct competitor with Meta. And they have a device called the Neo Pico 4 that is better than the Quest 2 in basically every single hardware category. Better lenses, faster speed, wider, view, all sorts of things like that. But if you had both devices sitting in front of you, and I had to tell you to pick one that's going to give you the best metaverse experience today, I'd still go towards the Quest 2 because of their software. But I'm sure Pico will do a pretty good job of mimicking most of that moving forward, which then now creates a legitimate competition for Meta, which is what we need. Consumers benefit from having competition, Nike versus Reebok, iOS versus Android, and now we're going to have a couple of companies who are building metaverse experiences, VR, AR metaverse experiences, competing directly with each other. I think consumers ultimately win if we get a single metaverse that all of these different headsets allow us to play in. That way, it didn't matter if you had a Quest headset or a Pico headset or a Valve Index, whatever it is, you would get to do all the metaverse stuff. But right now, like I told you about the sports watching stuff, there's ways of seeing it in different platforms, but the easiest way of just getting on and in 2 minutes be watching some live sporting event is through Facebook Horizons. And the only way you can use Facebook Horizons or Meta Horizons is with a Quest 2 or a Quest 1. You can't even do it with their Oculus Rift S. Their most recent desktop headset cannot use their software that I'm saying is really good. They've abandoned that. Everything's mobile VR now, where you can use it mobilely most of the time. And if you need to connect it to a computer, you can. And now the coolest thing is wireless PC VR. So I sit in my living room here with my Quest 2, and if I want to play some game that requires high-end graphics, I just wirelessly connect to my VR machine in my basement, and now I'm driving PC quality graphics through just a wireless streaming connection to my mobile headset. So it's the best of all the worlds. But we're in a pretty exciting time. Like I mentioned, Facebook Connect is tomorrow, and they're going to announce at least one new headset. It's going to be a more of a prosumer headset. We're kind of all making guesses on what the cost is going to be, but probably somewhere in the $1,500 range, which is a pretty big jump from what the Quest 2's at, but it's not a replacement for the Quest 2. What it is a new class of headset. I put it back to like when Apple first announced the iPhone XR. If you remember, I think we had the iPhone 8 Max, which was their next big iPhone. And then they announced this iPhone XR, which just had a stupid high price. And it's like, hey, this is the best. This is all the tech we can squeeze into a device. And if you want it, you're going to pay for it. And I feel like that's basically what this device is going to be. It's got, better lenses, lighter weight because of those better lenses. If you follow VR at all these days, one thing that you hear kind of coming from a lot of the different headsets is something called eye tracking. And a lot of folks might say, well, why is eye tracking good? Why do we care about eye tracking? Well, that's going to put our mobile VR devices on steroids, because if we know where you're looking inside of VR, we only have to show super high resolution exactly where you're looking. We don't have to dedicate the computation power to render the whole rest of the scene in 4K if you're only looking at this one spot. We just need to make that look beautiful. So now you got two options. You can have these mobile headsets which show VR or PC quality VR on them without having to add horsepower to it. But now you also, for PC-based VR, you can say, okay, well, we're going to go nuts with this, knowing that instead of using 100% of your graphics card to show the whole scene, we're only going to need to use 100% of your graphics card to show the scene right in front of you. So now all of a sudden you get ultra realistic virtual reality, which then rolls into the idea of augmented reality. So, and obviously I could go on and on for 20 hours on this topic, but there's some really cool stuff happening in VR and AR from a consumer and a prosumer perspective. And the I think the excitement for the rest of the year starts tomorrow morning when Meta announces their new headset, or possibly headsets, because the one little Easter egg I'll throw out there for your viewers, and this isn't something I necessarily have any specific knowledge about, but it's more of an interesting thing you can go check out yourself. If you go to meta.com, go to their base website, there's a video that starts playing that shows all these people wearing VR headsets and they're on bicycles. There's this big push for VR in like physical fitness, things like that. But what's fascinating is that headset that all these people are wearing in that video is not a Quest 2. It's not the Quest Pro they're about to announce, because the Quest Pro it's the worst kept secret in the world right now. Everybody knows what it looks like. And it's not the leaked Quest 3 headset. There's some headset that Meta has pasted all over their website that nobody's talking about. I'm speculating that there might be an announcement tomorrow around that headset, kind of a dumbed down version of this Pro that maybe is missing a couple of the features. But that ends up being a direct competitor with that Pico 4 I mentioned earlier, from Asia. And it's the reason why the Pico 4 is only currently being sold in Europe and Asia and not in the United States. I think the combination of them knowing that there's going to have a legitimate competitor in the US, along with, for some reason, Meta having this video of a headset they don't sell on their website, I find fascinating. But anyway,
Yeah.
starting tomorrow is going to be pretty exciting.
Wow, that's a ton of knowledge, and I didn't know that the ability to watch games was part of the offering. I'm going to have to do that, because that, to me, as a sports fan, Chicago Cubs right here in the background, of course, but it would be amazing to sit courtside for a game or on top of the basketball.
It's better than amazing. It's better than amazing.
Yeah.
You'll never go back to regular sports.
It's going to be tough for me to buy a ticket in the future.
Yeah, you can just sit there and imagine, like, oh, I could watch tennis like this. I can watch golf like this. In fact, they had a golf event last year where it was the Ryder Cup, where it was during the practice rounds, but they put 360 cameras on some of the caddies' golf bags, or some of the caddies, and you can listen. You could be watching the golf event from the caddies' perspective. And it's just ridiculous.
Yeah, sure. The future is very exciting. Right now is exciting. We're all building in a bear market, but you've built a lot of experiences through apps with your Awesome Fat company. So we were kind of talking about a few of them. One was Ant Flow. One was for Judge Joe Brown. So tell us about some of the apps that you've built.
Yeah. So, I mean, and this is kind of an interesting little backstory. Because of my particular vintage and being a geek, I was big into tabletop Dungeons and Dragons. So I came up to the Milwaukee area in 2006. So my whole house was still in boxes and things like that. And Apple had recently announced that they will have this app store thingy. So I was getting ready to play Dungeons and Dragons with some of my students, and my dice were still in boxes somewhere. And you have to bring I was a cool old school Dungeons and Dragons guy. I have a set of dice made out of Asteroid. I'm not just going to bring any D20 set. I'm bringing the cool stuff. Well, my wife hadn't done her job of unpacking it yet, because of course I just watch the unpacking process. I don't participate. But I decided, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and learn iOS development using a language called Objective-C. I'm going to write a dice roller. And I did. It took me about maybe 10 hours or so to write it the first time as I was learning their ecosystem. I now use that example. We write that app in my classes, and it takes, a half hour or 45 minutes now to write the app. And that's while explaining it. But I wrote that app, and then the day the App Store went live, I had two versions of that app. I had the D20 Gaming Dice and D20 Gaming Dice Pro, which allowed you to remember, what your warrior's broadsword attack is. Maybe it's 2d6 plus 3 or something like that. It allowed you to kind of put formulas. So you could just say roll broadsword, that kind of thing. So they were up there the first day of the App Store, and connecting some of the dots. Everybody and their brother bought every app that was on the App Store when it first came out. So that did pretty well financially. And then I had the first two real-time stock quote applications also available day one of the App Store. One was called Quotes RT, and then the other one was called Portfolio RT. Quotes RT showed you real-time stock quotes of all the indexes in the United States, as well as one stock of your choosing. Portfolio let you put in your entire portfolio and would show you real-time stock quotes on that. Terrible for your battery. Oh my gosh, you just burn through your battery like nothing, because it was constantly hitting the network to get the updated stock price or whatever. But it was a cool tool that, the only other way to do that was through a website or something like that, which then later turned into about a year later or so, turned into a cease and desist from the NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange. Actually, no, NASDAQ and the Dow Jones, telling me to, take my stuff down because I'm getting the real-time quotes in a way that doesn't pay them. They didn't like that, is what it came down to. But I had already made the money off of it, so that was a pretty easy decision to make, because at that point, you already had the other banks and stuff moving on to the app stores, E-Trade, all these were already on the App Store. So, I was making less and less from my apps, since there were now free commercial stuff out there. But those were apps I had on the App Store when it first went live, just day one, and then from there, once I saw that, okay, now as developers, because really it opened a world for developers. It's not just about mobile applications being cool, and now everybody's walking around with a smartphone and stuff like that. It created a new world for software developers. So this whole skill set that I've mentioned is kind of like, a superpower with computer programming. It now created an avenue where if you had an idea for a piece of software, you no longer had to write it, then go find a publisher who could talk to Best Buy to get it on the shelves at actual Best Buy and get published, almost like writing a book. You no longer had to go through that process. Now you pay your $100 a year to Apple, and you can release apps on their App Store whenever you want. Now, your app might not do well, but at least you could take a risk on it without having to jump through 50 hoops. So we created a business model around individual developers instead of software development companies. So it was really an exciting time, I think, for computer scientists and coders, and it's what's led us to the big movement in coding today, where coding has become, popular. Where before we knew that, they're just smart geeks, they're writing our software, but now the world runs on more and more of this software. So people who have this skill set of coding, I think they can do a lot with it, and too often they take that for granted. I try to tell my freshmen that, they don't believe me until they're seniors.
So yeah, you told me a good teaching story too as well. So in 2010 at Concordia, you were transacting on Bitcoin in your class, and at the time it was worth a quarter. So tell us a little bit about what you were building with your students there.
Sure. So like I had mentioned that, I came to Concordia when I was doing a lot of my business stuff in Chicago. So before that, I was teaching at Western Illinois University, which is it's in the boonies in Illinois. So I was having to drive 4 and 5 hours to go meet with clients in Chicago. Well, my wife didn't really want to live in Chicago, so we came to the Milwaukee area. Started at Concordia, and kind of a very good collaboration. Concordia is a Christian school. I consider myself to be a pretty strong Christian, so is my wife. So they typically don't get folks with my background, and I was given a lot of flexibility to come and work for what they're able to pay. So very good collaboration type thing there. But we created a course in the computer science department there, CSC 390, which is our special topics course, which effectively became known as whatever Litman's interested in this week, or this semester. The course was going to be on that. So I taught a course dealing with blockchain. And at that time, there was only really one. I mean, there were these altcoins, but it wasn't cool yet. So we were using Bitcoin in class. But back then, Bitcoin was worth, I don't know, 50 cents a coin, something like that, not what it's worth today. Right. So, in the videos for the class, you see I have like 300,000 Bitcoin in my wallet on this thing. And where we were writing a voting system, because it's in a computer science class. So we're writing a piece of software that was operating as a simplified voting system, kind of proof of concept of something blockchain can be used for. I mentioned to you offline that I am not an advocate of crypto as money. Something I say to people is we're no longer nowhere close to grandpa buying milk with Bitcoin, or insert favorite alt currency in there. Grandpa's not going to be buying milk with that anytime soon. In fact, I think it's the biggest thing that holds crypto back or holds blockchain back is the idea that humans have viewed it as a tradable commodity. The second we throw the word currency on the bottom, and all of a sudden we're buying and selling, we've created this whole market around it, which, I mean, this isn't to demonize people. This is how people are. We've done it with gold and silver and things like that. We like looking at opportunities and trying to take advantage of those opportunities. But what's happened in that process is we've taken our eye off of the real gem here, and that's the technology behind blockchain. So in that course, I wasn't teaching it as an investment course on blockchain. I was teaching it as, hey, we have this blockchain known as the Bitcoin blockchain. What are some practical things we can use blockchain technology for that might solve certain problems better than we're solving them today? And voting is a perfect example, and probably is more meaningful to people today than ever, right? Our recent presidential election, you obviously have a whole bunch of people on all the sides about, was the voting accurate? Was it not accurate? Well, with blockchain, we would know if it's accurate or not. But unfortunately, the way politics works is, that's not going to probably be something that blockchain is going to move into anytime soon, because depending on which side of the coin you're on, it might not be in your best advantage to have everybody be able to vote easily, things like that. So voting for elections is more complicated than just counting votes. It's getting the right people to the polls and things like that. That the game that the pollsters are playing is a game that's been around for a long time, and it's more complicated than just counting votes. So I don't think we're going to be replacing that anytime soon. But in my class, I was using blockchain to say, hey, if we sent all the votes for candidate X to this Bitcoin address, and all the votes for candidate Y to this Bitcoin address, it's now completely transparent to anybody who wants to look at the public blockchain, so they can do the recount themselves over and over and over and over again and confirm the result. But I was doing that in class, and I just go back and look at it now, and by the price of Bitcoin today, and especially the price of Bitcoin a couple of years ago, we were transacting, like hundreds of thousands of dollars during a class period, just willy-nilly, like just no big deal. Let's test this. And, every single time you run it, back then, the transaction fees were not very high, but in terms of number of Bitcoin, but, you might have had a single Satoshi as the transaction fee, which might be worth $40 now or something like that. It's kind of funny history stuff. But yeah, that's kind of where it started with me for crypto, as I saw an opportunity there, and I looked at blockchain as a data structure and how we can use it to solve generalistic problems, not what's our replacement for the US dollar. Sure, we can sit here and complain about fiat currencies all we want, but you know what? They've worked for a while, and I don't think they're going anywhere anytime soon, and that's probably not a fight worth fighting at this point. But if we can come up with cool uses of blockchain outside of that, I think we all win.
Yes, I agree with that totally. So even though you burned a lot of Bitcoin back in the day for educational purposes, of course, you still managed. I still want to hear the yacht story, but you also have this amazing Tesla that I want our viewers to see. So that's what you drive around in, and it's awesome fat, which is your competitive eating name, your company name. But let's hear the yacht story.
Yeah, so I mean, this is more of a I don't know, personal development type story, and really something I share with my students and the people, because I'm involved in a lot of entrepreneurial type stuff. Have become kind of one of the angel investors in a lot of different things, so I fund different companies and stuff like that. And not a lot of this came from money that I made off of some of the things we've talked about today, which I could probably say was right time, right place, right skill set. It's kind of luck, right? There's lots of people who can code today, and things that I made money off of today, things I made money off of back then, I wouldn't make very much money off of today, as an example. But yeah, so this had to be 2012, maybe. I decided, so I'm up in the Milwaukee area, Mequon, Wisconsin area, and I live close to Lake Michigan. Well, I don't know much about boats or anything like that, but I'm thinking, okay, you know what? I'm rich. I'm near Lake Michigan. I should have a yacht. So I just went and bought this $500,000 yacht on impulse, because yeah, I didn't even know how to drive the thing. Just all sorts of stupidity flowing out of the brain there. But it ended up being a good thing for me, because it was kind of that final eye opener thing. Because I think leading up to that point, I viewed the world through a lens of your value against somebody else is how big your bank account is. And every single decision I made every single day was based on, oh, how can I make the next buck? How can I do the take advantage of the next cool thing? I didn't really think about legacy and how can I leave my mark behind probably at all. Where now that's kind of my main focus. I like to get involved in all of the little, cool things that are coming up, not so much from a money-making perspective. Sometimes that takes care of itself. But I try to make decisions based on what I'm passionate about, what I want to spend my time doing. And what I have found is that if you follow your passion, the money part typically takes care of itself one way or another. But for a long time, I would just chase the dollar and then learn how to repeat that over and over again. And that yacht was kind of my my line in the sand, if you will. So I bought it, and then like, okay, well, I don't know how to drive it. I barely used it. I kind of took some academic interest in learning how to drive it a little bit, but it wasn't practical to take a boat of that size out for like 20 minutes. It was like this major thing, and it became kind of a depression point for me, where it's like, well, why did I do this? What decision making went into thinking this was like a good idea? So I ended up finally just selling it, took a bath on it. I just needed to get rid of it, almost like taking medicine. And then I used that kind of as my rebirth story, if you will, where I think I became kind of the person I am today, where I stopped chasing the dollar. I've probably been every bit as successful, if not more successful, since then, if you're measuring success from a money earning perspective, but without chasing the money. Instead, I've been chasing technology things typically that I'm passionate about. And that's come in the form of things like blockchain, VR, AR, quantum stuff now. There was a lot of JavaScript side languages in the middle there that were always interesting, all the little buzzwords we hear in the software development world. But that was a life-changing event for me that came from a bad financial decision. That didn't hurt me long-term financially, but definitely hurt me long-term from an ego perspective and a self-worth perspective, something like that.
Yeah, and we were talking earlier about how people are a currency because someone has something to offer, right? And I like the analogies that you were describing. Can you describe that for our viewers?
Yeah. So, when people come together, historically, I would always view as like, okay, everybody here is here to see me. I'm the rich guy in the room. They either want money from me, want my support, blah, 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 whatever it is. But the reality is, if you look at the people around the table with you, each one of them brings a talent to the table. Some talent. I believe everybody's talented at something. Maybe they haven't figured out what that talent is, but I think everybody has a God-given gift or gifts that they can share. And each one of those can be viewed as currency. Okay, so even if I look at some of my like freshman computer science students that maybe don't have a whole lot of experience with some of the programming stuff yet, I have a bad back. These guys have strong backs. If I need something moved at my house, they'll come over and they'll help me and blah, blah, blah. That's a currency, because if they didn't do that, not only am I going to hurt my back, I'm going to spend another $4,000 on doctor's bills, something like that, trying to get things popped back into position or whatever. So not viewing people's skill set in a way that doesn't devalue things that you either aren't good at or don't value. Because in my world, I might say, well, if you can't code or you don't have money, you're dead to me. Something like that. Or I need so many other skills after that that maybe I don't possess, that I rely on other people to have. And why should I knock them down when they are required components to get where ultimately my passion is, where I want to go with blockchain, quantum, whatever it is. So viewing each person's talents as the currency they bring to the table, which can be kind of analogous to all these different altcoins in the blockchain world. Somebody's going to have, well, Dogecoin was kind of a funny analogy of that, right? As soon as Elon Musk started babbling about it, the thing went through the roof, and a zillion people made a whole bunch of money on Dogecoin. I mean, which is just a stupid meme coin. It's a nothing coin. It's meaningless. But people made money off of it just because of hype.
Yeah, the power of community. We're all angry at the way the world is operating, especially during COVID. So it caused this resurgence of people like myself. But you brought up Elon Musk. You guys have a superpower that you share called Asperger's. So tell us how you've been able to leverage that, to really hyper focus and succeed at what you do.
Yeah, so Asperger's is a form of autism that it's typically, sometimes it's called like savant syndrome, or it's a type of high functioning autism. And what's interesting, I work with a lot of families who have kids that are somewhere on the spectrum. For a long time, doctors, well, even today, they like giving diagnoses. They say, you have this or you have that. Where the reality is, I think all of us are somewhere on this spectrum. Somewhere in there, there's your unique personality traits that make you, as opposed to this being a problem or a sickness, something like that. Well, when I was younger, I was always, the weird kid. I had pretty weak social skills, things like that. I don't even remember the exact age, but I mean, it was fairly young, maybe 6 or 7 years old. I kind of remember making some sort of decision where I'm like, okay, I can either be the weird kid and not have friends, blah, 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 or I can embrace my eccentricity and, take this as my superpower and go and do something with it. Kind of, and you really saw an example of it that night. I mean, where I walked up to you and I was like, oh, you're going to want to interview me. I'm like difficult to ignore, because I drag this huge personality with me. Now, once you get to know me, maybe you realize he's not just full of crap, but, the point is that, I don't wait for somebody to notice me. I make myself noticed. I become the center of attention or whatever, and I have a lot of confidence in my skill sets. Now, having said that, I mentioned earlier that a lot of times Asperger's is kind of known as like savant syndrome or something like that. It typically will make people very good at a couple of things, but maybe very bad at some other things. You have a lot of, of our top musicians that maybe are completely non-functional in a bunch of other areas of their life, but they can just write beautiful music, something like that. Well, I feel like all of my strengths that come from Asperger's are in line with the things that I am also passionate about. So computer programming is kind of a good example. My mind just works that way. When I started coding when I was 9, I took to it really quickly, and it's how I think. And that gave me this superpower that I can kind of leverage, like, you know, like I weaponize computer programming to do my bidding and all these different things. And I'm always trying to solve problems using something with technology. So I've taken this, what a lot of people would call a disability, and I look at it as my superpower, and how can I let it set me apart from everybody else? And the mechanics that I teach to families who struggle with their kids about this is I try to treat life like a video game. And even this conversation we're having right now historically would not have come very easy to me. But I practiced like almost treating you like a boss fight in a video game. And I'm thinking, okay, well, what's the next thing I need to say to kind of stay ahead or keep online, whatever it is. And it eventually just became second nature. So I don't know if I'm still faking it or I just learned how to do it, whatever it is, but kind of gamifying life I have found works well for you know, people that are somewhere on the spectrum. Turn your perceived weaknesses into your superpower, something along those lines.
Yes, and the advice you gave earlier was follow your passion, which is exactly what I've been doing. And I feel like a lot of builders in Web3 are just realizing that they can create something that they're passionate about. They can use all their entire skill sets from all their life and create a community and be supported. And that's why this is such an exciting time. So Dr. Michael Litman, thank you so much for your time. This has been so insightful, so knowledgeable. I really, truly appreciate everything that you brought to the table today.
You got it. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and I love your background too. We like match colors. We're both metaverse-y. You know, it's been great.
Well, I said this isn't even my background. This is actually my kitchen. My wife was ticked.
Well, it's gorgeous. Thank you so much.
Yep. You take care.